The morning sun filtered through the crystal dome of the Galactic Technical Institute as students from 12 different worlds shuffled into Engineering Lab 7. The room buzzed with alien conversations in dozens of languages, creating a strange symphony of clicks, whistles, and harmonious tones that somehow managed to sound almost musical. Jake Morrison pushed through the crowd of towering beings, his human height making him feel like a child walking among giants. At 6 feet tall, he was considered average for his species, but here he barely reached the shoulder joints of most of his classmates. He found his usual seat in the middle section and pulled out his tablet, checking his notes from the previous lecture. The Zentaurian student Kleptok settled into the seat beside him with the fluid grace that characterized his species. His arms moved independently as he arranged his materials while his large, compound eyes tracked the movement of other students around the room. Kleptok had become something of a friend over the semester, though their conversations were always formal and precise in the way that Zentaurians preferred. "Good cycle, Jake Morrison," Kleptok said in his careful, translated standard. "Are you prepared for today's project announcement?" "As ready as I can be," Jake replied, glancing around the room. "Any idea what Professor Zixthara has planned for us?" Before Kleptok could answer, the temperature in the room dropped several degrees and a soft chiming sound filled the air. These were the traditional signals that announced the arrival of a vegan collective member. The students immediately quieted and turned their attention to the front of the classroom. Professor Zixthara entered through the main doorway, her crystalline body catching and reflecting the morning light in brilliant patterns across the walls. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, she moved with the deliberate, measured steps that her species favored. Her translucent form shifted through various shades of blue and purple, indicating she was in a teaching mood according to the xenobiology courses Jake had taken. "Students," she began, her voice carrying the musical quality that made vegan speech so distinctive, "today marks the beginning of your final project for this term." Jake straightened in his seat. Final projects at the Institute were serious business, often determining whether a student would advance to the next level or need to repeat coursework. More importantly for Jake, his performance here would affect his chances of gaining acceptance into the advanced engineering program. Professor Zixthara moved to the center of the room and activated the holographic display system. A three-dimensional image appeared above her head, showing what looked like a basic shelter structure surrounded by various environmental hazards. "Your assignment," she continued, "is to design and construct a meteor impact shelter. The shelter must be capable of protecting 5 beings for a minimum of 72 hours following a Class C meteor strike." Murmurs rippled through the classroom as students began discussing the requirements with their neighbors. Jake leaned forward, studying the specifications that appeared alongside the holographic display. Class C meteor impacts were serious business, capable of creating localized destruction and atmospheric disturbances that could last for days. "The materials available to you," Professor Zixthara went on, "will be limited to what can be found in Fabrication Lab 3. No outside resources may be imported, and no assistance from faculty or advanced students is permitted." Jake made quick notes on his tablet, already running through mental calculations about structural requirements and life support systems. The challenge seemed straightforward enough, though he suspected there would be complications he hadn't considered yet. Each species will be evaluated according to their natural capabilities and expected performance standards, the professor announced, her crystalline form shifting to a more orange hue. "Therefore, time allowances will vary." This caught Jake's attention. He had heard about variable time limits before, usually based on the assumption that different species worked at different speeds and had different approaches to problem solving. Professor Zixthara began calling out species names and their assigned time limits. The Zentaurians received 2 full galactic weeks, which made sense given their methodical approach to engineering. The Felinians got 10 days, accounting for their artistic tendencies that often led to beautiful but time-consuming designs. Other species received various amounts of time based on what the Institute considered their natural working pace. Jake Morrison, Professor Zixthara called out, her eyes focusing on him with what might have been amusement. As our sole human representative, you will have 3 hours. Jake blinked, certain he had misheard. Around him, several students made sounds that could have been laughter in their respective languages. 3 hours to design and build a meteor. Shelter while other species got weeks. Excuse me, Professor, Jake said, raising his hand. Did you say 3 hours? That is correct, she replied, her form shifting to a slightly more green tone. Humans are known throughout the galaxy for their rapid, if somewhat crude, construction methods. Your species tends to favor speed and basic functionality over the more refined approaches preferred by other civilizations. 3 hours should be more than sufficient for a human to create an adequate shelter. Jake felt heat rising in his cheeks, but he kept his voice level. And the requirements are the same? Protection for 5 beings, 72-hour duration. Class E impact resistance? Precisely the same, Professor Zixthara confirmed. Each student will be judged on how well they meet these requirements using methods appropriate to their species' capabilities. The implication was clear. The professor expected him to throw together some basic structure that would barely meet the minimum requirements, probably assuming that human engineering was more about quick fixes than proper solutions. Jake had encountered this attitude before. During his time at the Institute, the assumption that human technology was primitive compared to the elegant solutions developed by older civilizations. When do we begin? Jake asked. You may start immediately after this briefing concludes, Professor Zixthara said. Other students will have time to plan and research. However, given your abbreviated timeline, I suggest you proceed directly to the fabrication lab. Jake nodded, already standing and gathering his materials. As he prepared to leave, Kluptok placed one of his 4 hands on Jake's shoulder. Perhaps you should request additional time, the Zenturian suggested quietly. It would not be unreasonable given the complexity of the task. Thanks, but 3 hours will be fine, Jake replied, slinging his bag over his shoulder. He could feel the eyes of his classmates following him as he walked toward the door. Some seemed sympathetic. Others appeared curious about what the human would manage to accomplish in such a short time. A few were clearly expecting to witness a spectacular failure. Jake paused at the doorway and turned back to Professor Zixthara. Just to confirm, Professor, the shelter needs to protect 5 beings for 72 hours against a Class C meteor impact, using only materials from Fabrication Lab 3, and it needs to be completed in 3 hours? That is correct, and I'm being evaluated on the same standards as everyone else? Professor Zixthara's crystalline form flickered slightly, perhaps indicating surprise at his persistence. You will be evaluated on how effectively your solution meets the stated requirements, yes? Jake nodded and smiled. Perfect. I'll see you in 3 hours. As he left the classroom, he could hear the buzz of conversation resuming behind him. His classmates were probably discussing his chances of success, most likely concluding that the human was either very confident or completely delusional. Jake walked quickly through the corridors toward Fabrication Lab 3, his mind already working through the project requirements. 3 hours to build a meteor shelter. Most of his classmates thought it was impossible, and his professor clearly expected him to produce something barely functional. They were about to learn something important about human engineering philosophy. When human lives were on the line, barely functional wasn't even close to good enough. Jake pushed through the doors of Fabrication Lab 3 and immediately began his survey of available materials. The lab was massive, filled with organized sections of construction supplies, tools, and equipment that students could use for their projects. Most species would spend days just cataloging what was available, But Jake had learned long ago that time was always the enemy in any engineering project. He pulled out his tablet and started a quick inventory, moving through the lab with practice. Efficiency. Standard construction foam lined one wall in various density grades. Basic atmospheric processors sat on shelves nearby, along with air recycling units and oxygen generators. Energy cells of different capacities were stored in a secured section, along with power distribution systems and backup batteries. The metallic plating section contained sheets of various alloys, from lightweight aluminum composites to heavy-duty titanium variants. Jake ran his hands along the materials, checking thickness and flexibility. In his experience, the best solutions often came from combining materials in ways that individual specifications never anticipated. Tools filled another section of the lab. Plasma cutters, molecular welders, gravity lifts, and standard construction equipment were all available. Jake was pleased to see several pieces of Earth-designed equipment mixed in with the alien technology. Human tools might be considered primitive by galactic standards, but they were reliable, and he understood exactly how they worked. 30 minutes for survey and planning, Jake muttered to himself, checking the time on his tablet. 2.5 hours for actual construction. He found an empty workbench and spread out his tablet, opening a basic design program. While his alien classmates would spend days creating detailed blueprints with artistic flourishes and elegant mathematical proofs, Jake needed something that would work and work fast. His fingers moved quickly across the tablet screen, sketching out a basic floor plan. Not a simple dome or cube like most species would build, but a multi-chamber design that made efficient use of space while providing redundancy for critical systems. He had learned in his military engineering training that single points of failure were the enemy of survival. The sound of footsteps made him look up. Several of his classmates had entered the lab, apparently wanting to observe what the human would do with his impossible timeline. Kleptak approached the workbench, his compound eyes examining Jake's rough sketches. "This appears to be significantly larger than the minimum requirements," Kleptak observed in his precise way of speaking. "Are you certain you can construct such a complex structure in the remaining time?" "It's not that complex," Jake replied, adding some quick measurements to his design. "Just efficient use of space." Whisper of Stars, the Felinian student, patted over on her silent feet. Her cat-like features showed curiosity as she looked at the tablet screen. "Your design lacks aesthetic consideration," she said in her musical voice. "The professor often favors elegant solutions." Jake looked up at her. "Where I come from, we have a saying. Pretty is as pretty does. If it keeps people alive, it's beautiful enough." More students had gathered around his workbench now, creating a small crowd of interested observers. Jake noticed that none of them were working on their own projects yet. Most species at the Institute preferred to spend considerable time in the planning phase before beginning any actual construction. "Jake Morrison," came a familiar voice from behind the group of students. "I was hoping to find you here." The students parted to reveal Lisa Carter, a human exchange student from the Xenobiology department. She was one of only 3 humans currently studying at the Institute, and Jake had shared meals with her several times during the semester. Her presence immediately made him feel less alone among all the alien observers. "Hey Lisa," Jake said, not looking up from his design work. "Come to watch the human make a fool of himself." "Actually, I came to wish you luck," she replied, moving closer to examine his sketches. "I heard about the 3-hour limit. That's pretty harsh, even for Professor Zixthara." "It's fine," Jake said, adding some structural details to his plans. 3 hours is plenty of time." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because looking at this design, it seems like you're planning to build something way beyond what the assignment requires." Jake paused his work and looked around at the assembled students. They were all listening intently, clearly curious about human construction methods. Some of them probably expected him to fail spectacularly, while others seemed genuinely interested in seeing a different approach to engineering problems. The assignment says to build a shelter that can protect 5 beings for 72 hours. Jake said slowly, but that's just the minimum requirement. The real question is what happens after those 72 hours are up. Kleptok tilted his head in the way Zentarians did when they were processing new information. The assignment does not specify requirements beyond the 72-hour period. That's right, Jake agreed. But disasters don't work on assignment schedules. What if the meteor impact is worse than expected? What if rescue takes longer than 3 days? What if the people in the shelter get hurt or sick while they're waiting? The alien students exchanged glances. This was clearly not how they had been thinking about the problem. Your species builds for contingencies that are not specified in the requirements, Whisper of Stars observed. This seems inefficient. Jake laughed, but not in a mean way. Let me tell you something about human history. We've survived ice ages, plagues, wars, natural disasters, and every other catastrophe you can imagine. We learned a long time ago that the minimum requirements for survival aren't actually enough to survive. He turned back to his tablet and continued working on his design. Every human disaster shelter is built with the assumption that things will go wrong, equipment will fail, people will get hurt, rescue will be delayed, the weather will be worse than predicted. Lisa nodded, understanding where Jake was going with his explanation. We call it defensive engineering, she added. Build it strong enough to handle twice what you expect, because reality has a way of exceeding expectations. But surely this approach requires significantly more resources, Kleptok pointed out. Such over-engineering would be wasteful in most circumstances. Jake finished his basic design and started making a materials list. Maybe, but wasted resources don't matter if everyone survives. Dead people can't appreciate efficiency. He stood up and stretched, checking the time again. His survey and planning phase had taken exactly 30 minutes, leaving him with 2.5 hours for construction. The gathered students watched as he began gathering materials from around the lab. The other species will create beautiful, elegant solutions, Jake said as he loaded metallic plating onto a gravity lift. They'll use exactly the right amount of materials and energy to meet the stated requirements. Their shelters will be works of art. He paused and looked around at his audience. But if I were stuck in a real meteor impact situation, I wouldn't want to be in an elegant shelter. I'd want to be in something built by someone who assumed everything would go wrong and planned. Accordingly, Jake began moving materials to his chosen construction area, a clear space near the center of the lab. The alien students continued to watch, some making notes on their own tablets. He could see them beginning to understand that human engineering came from a very different philosophical approach than what they were used to. You're not just building a shelter, Lisa realized, watching Jake arrange his materials with military precision. You're building a survival bunker. Jake smiled as he fired up the first of his construction tools. Now you're getting it. Time to show these folks how humans really build things. The alien students settled in to watch, their curiosity overcoming their own project deadlines. They were about to witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about construction, efficiency, and the human approach to survival. Jake activated the plasma cutter and began his work with the kind of focused intensity that his alien observers had never seen before. His movements were quick but precise, cutting metallic sheets into sections that matched the measurements on his tablet. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. Every cut served a specific purpose in his larger design. The crowd of watching students had grown larger. Word was spreading through the institute that the human was attempting something unprecedented. In Fabrication Lab 3, even some faculty members had begun to drift in, curious to see what Jake Morrison would accomplish in his impossible timeline. Jake worked in layers, starting with foundation supports that would anchor his structure to the lab floor. Instead of the simple circular or square foundations that most species used, he created an interconnected grid system that distributed weight and stress across multiple points. Each support beam connected to at least 3 others, creating redundancy. That would keep the structure stable even if several supports failed. "His foundation work is excessive," murmured one of the crystalline observers to another. "Such over-engineering wastes both time and materials." Lisa heard the comment and stepped closer to the speaker. "That's not waste," she said quietly. "That's insurance. Human structures are built to survive things going wrong." Jake moved onto the walls, and this was where his approach really began to diverge from standard galactic construction methods. Instead of single-layer walls made from one material, he created composite barriers using 3 different types of plating. The outer layer was high-density titanium alloy for impact resistance. The middle layer was a lighter aluminum composite designed to absorb and distribute energy. The inner layer was a specialized material that would maintain structural integrity, even under extreme temperature changes between each layer. Jake sprayed construction foam that would harden into additional shock absorption. The technique created walls that were significantly thicker than anything his classmates would build, but also far more resistant to the kind of damage that meteor impacts could cause. "He's building walls that could withstand military bombardment," Whisper of Stars observed, her feline eyes tracking Jake's efficient movements. "The assignment only requires Class C meteor protection." Kleptok was taking detailed notes on his own tablet. "His construction methods appear crude, but the underlying engineering principles are sophisticated. He's creating multiple independent systems that can function even if adjacent systems fail." By the end of his first hour, Jake had completed the basic structure of what was clearly going to be much more than a simple shelter. The foundation and walls outlined a complex that contained at least 4 separate chambers, each connected by reinforced doorways that could be sealed independently. Jake paused briefly to check his tablet and take a drink of water. The physical work was demanding, even with the assistance of gravity lifts and automated tools. He noticed Professor Zixthara entering the lab, her crystalline form shifting to colors that indicated intense curiosity. "Interesting approach, Jake." "Morrison," the professor said, moving closer to examine his work. "You appear to be constructing something significantly beyond the scope of the assignment." Jake wiped sweat from his forehead and continued working on the wall sections. "I'm building to the specifications you gave me, Professor. Protection for 5 beings, 72-hour duration, Class C impact resistance." "Yes, but your structure appears designed for much more than those minimum requirements." "That's correct," Jake agreed, not slowing his work pace. "I'm building for what actually happens in disasters, not just what the assignment assumes will happen." Professor Zixthara's form shifted to a more orange hue, indicating confusion. "Could you elaborate on that distinction?" Jake sealed another wall section and moved on to installing the first of several atmospheric processors. In every disaster humans have ever faced, the actual situation was worse than the initial predictions. Storms are stronger than forecast. Earthquakes last longer than expected. Rescue operations get delayed. Equipment fails when you need it most. He connected power cables to the atmospheric processor with practiced efficiency. "So we don't build for the best-case scenario. We build for the worst-case scenario, and then we add backup systems for when even that isn't enough." The second hour of construction saw Jake's shelter transform into something that looked more like a miniature space station than a simple protective structure. He installed not 1 but 3 separate atmospheric processors, each capable of supporting the required 5 beings independently. Power systems included primary energy cells, backup batteries, and even a small manual generator that could be operated if all other power sources failed. His life support systems have triple redundancy, noted one of the faculty observers. Even if 2 complete systems failed, the shelter would remain fully operational. Jake had moved on to what appeared to be a separate workshop area within his complex. He installed tool storage, basic fabrication equipment, and even a small materials recycle unit. The alien observers exchanged confused glances. The assignment made no mention of manufacturing capabilities. "Why are you including production facilities?" asked Dr. Vorthak, a senior engineering instructor who had joined the growing crowd of observers. Jake looked up from connecting a molecular assembler to the power grid. "Because in a real disaster, things break and you need to fix them. People get hurt and you need medical supplies. Resources run out and you need to make more." He gestured to the workshop area he was creating. "This isn't just a place to hide and wait for rescue. It's a place where people can maintain their equipment, treat injuries, and even continue working on solutions to their problems." Lisa had been watching the progress with growing amazement. As another human, she understood Jake's reasoning better than the alien observers, but even she was impressed by the scope of what he was building in such a short time. "Jake," she said during a brief pause in his work, "this is incredible. But are you sure you can finish everything in the time you have left?" Jake checked his tablet. 1 hour and 15 minutes remaining. "I'll finish," he said simply. "The question is how much extra I can add." The alien students and faculty continued to watch in fascination as Jake worked through his final hour. What had started as skepticism about human construction methods was gradually transforming into something approaching awe. None of them had ever seen someone work with such sustained intensity, while maintaining precise attention to detail. By the time Jake entered his final hour of construction, his shelter had grown into a complete survival complex. Multiple chambers, redundant life support, workshop facilities, and structural integrity that exceeded military specifications. But he wasn't finished yet. "What is he adding now?" Professor Zixthara asked, her colors cycling through patterns that indicated deep interest. Jake was installing what appeared to be a communication array on the outer structure of his complex. "Contact with the outside world," he explained. "Because isolation kills hope, and hope is what keeps people alive when everything else goes wrong." Jake finished the communication array with 12 minutes to spare and stepped back to survey his completed work. What had started as a simple assignment to build a basic Meteor shelter had become a comprehensive survival bunker that could house 20 beings instead of 5 and operate independently for weeks instead of hours. The crowd of observers had grown to include nearly half the Institute's engineering faculty and dozens of students from multiple departments. Professor Zixthara moved through the complex, her crystalline form shifting through colors that indicated deep analysis as she examined each system and component. "Construction phase complete," Jake announced, wiping his hands on a cleaning cloth. "Ready for testing whenever you are, Professor." Professor Zixthara's form flickered through several color patterns before settling on a deep blue that suggested she was processing something unexpected. "Jake Morrison, before we begin testing, I must ask, are you certain this structure was built using only materials from this laboratory?" "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied. "Every component came from the approved materials list. I can show you the inventory records if you want." The professor examined her own tablet, checking the automated tracking systems that monitored material usage in the fabrication lab. Her colors shifted to what might have been confusion. "The records indicate you used approximately 40% more materials than most students typically require for this assignment." "That's probably right," Jake agreed. "I built for durability and redundancy instead of minimum compliance." Dr. Vorthak, the senior engineering instructor, moved closer to examine the wall construction. "These composite barriers are significantly more robust than standard shelter walls. How did you achieve such density in the available time?" Jake walked over to demonstrate his layering technique. It's not complicated. You just have to work fast and plan ahead. While one section is hardening, you move on to the next. By the time you finish the last section, the first is ready for the next layer. The testing phase began immediately. Professor Zixthara activated the holographic simulation system that would subject all student shelters to the same standardized testing protocol. The other student projects were arranged throughout the lab, each one representing their species' approach to the shelter assignment. Kleptok's shelter was a marvel of Zentarian engineering precision. The crystalline dome structure was mathematically perfect, with precisely calculated wall thickness and exactly the minimum power requirements to maintain life support for 5 beings for 72 hours. It was elegant, efficient, and met every requirement with no waste. Whisper of Stars had created something that could only be described as architectural art. Her spiral design was beautiful to look at, with flowing curves that seemed to dance, even when motionless. The Felinian approach emphasized harmony between function and form, creating a shelter that would be as pleasant to live in as it was protective. Other alien students had produced similarly elegant solutions, each reflecting their species' particular strengths and cultural values. Some emphasized energy efficiency, others focused on mathematical perfection, and a few prioritized aesthetic beauty alongside functionality. Then there was Jake's complex, which looked like a military installation compared to the refined designs of his classmates. The simulation began with standard Class C Meteor impact parameters. Seismic shaking, atmospheric pressure changes, temperature fluctuations, and debris impacts were all part of the testing protocol. Every shelter would be evaluated on how well it protected its occupants while maintaining life support systems. The alien shelters performed exactly as expected. Each one met the minimum requirements with elegant efficiency. Kleptok's dome maintained perfect atmospheric conditions while using minimal power. Whisper of Stars' spiral design gracefully absorbed impact stresses while providing comfortable living conditions. All of the designs demonstrated the sophisticated engineering capabilities of their respective species. Jake's bunker didn't just meet the requirements. It exceeded them so dramatically that Professor Zixthara had to check her equipment to make sure the readings were accurate, while the other shelters maintained adequate protection against Class C impacts. Jake's structure showed no stress indicators at all. The triple-layered walls absorbed impacts that would have damaged conventional shelters. The foundation system distributed seismic forces so effectively that the interior remained completely stable. Fascinating, murmured Dr. Vorthak, studying the structural analysis readouts. His design is showing 0 stress indicators under full Class C impact simulation. Professor Zixthara made an adjustment to the testing parameters. Let us increase the simulation intensity to determine the actual limits of each design. She gradually increased the impact forces, moving from Class C to Class B intensity. The alien shelters began showing stress indicators as the simulation exceeded their design parameters, but remained functional within acceptable safety margins. Jake's bunker continued to show minimal stress even under Class B impacts. Remarkable, Professor Zixthara said, her form cycling through rapid color changes, increased to Class A parameters. Class A meteor impacts were devastating events that could level entire city blocks. The simulation subjected the test structures to forces that far exceeded the original assignment requirements. Most of the alien shelters began showing critical stress indicators, though their elegant designs continued to function within emergency parameters. Jake's bunker absorbed Class A impacts as if they were minor disturbances, but the real difference became apparent when Professor Zixthara activated the extended duration testing. While the assignment only required 72 hours of operation, she extended the simulation to test the actual operational limits of each design. The alien shelters performed admirably for their design duration, but began showing efficiency decreases as systems approached their calculated limits. Kleptok's shelter maintained perfect conditions for exactly 72 hours before power consumption began increasing. Whisper of Star's design provided comfortable conditions for the required time, then gradually became less pleasant as systems strained. Jake's complex continued operating as if the test had just begun. The triple redundant life support systems meant that even if 2 complete systems failed, the shelter would remain fully operational. The expanded power systems could run for weeks instead of hours. The workshop area would allow occupants to manufacture replacement parts for any equipment that did fail. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Vorthak observed, watching the readouts from Jake's bunker. His structure is not just meeting the assignment parameters. It is exceeding them by orders of magnitude. Lisa watched the testing with growing amazement. She had expected Jake to do well, but this was beyond anything she had imagined possible. His bunker wasn't just better than the other designs. It was operating in a completely different category of engineering capability. Halfway through the extended testing period, Professor Zixthara made another adjustment to the simulation. She activated emergency scenarios that were not part of the standard testing protocol. Equipment failures, power outages, structural damage, and medical emergencies were added to the simulation to see how each shelter would respond to unexpected complications. The alien shelters handled the additional challenges with the grace and efficiency that characterized their designs, but several began approaching their operational limits as multiple systems were stressed. Simultaneously, Jake's bunker responded to each emergency scenario as if it had been specifically designed for that exact problem. Power failures were handled by backup systems. Equipment failures were addressed using the workshop facilities. Medical emergencies could be treated in the dedicated medical bay that Jake had included in his design. He built for scenarios that were not part of the assignment, Professor Zixthara observed, her crystalline form now cycling through colors that none of the students had seen before. "His shelter is responding to emergencies that we did not even include in our testing parameters." The extended testing continued for several more hours, with Professor Zixthara pushing the simulation far beyond anything that would normally be required for a student project. She was no longer testing to see if the shelters met the assignment requirements. She was testing to understand the fundamental differences between human and alien approaches to engineering. The testing finally concluded after 6 hours of simulation, far longer than the standard evaluation period. Professor Zixthara deactivated the holographic systems and stood silent for several minutes, her crystalline form cycling through color patterns that suggested deep contemplation. The gathered students and faculty waited quietly, unsure what to make of what they had witnessed. Jake sat on a workbench, drinking water and checking the final readouts on his tablet. His bunker had performed flawlessly through every test, emergency, scenario, and simulation that Professor Zixthara had thrown at it. More importantly to him, it had done exactly what he designed it to do: keep people alive and functioning, no matter what went wrong. "Jake Morrison," Professor Zixthara finally said, her voice carrying a tone that none of her students had heard before. "Please explain your design philosophy to the class." Jake looked around at the assembled aliens, all of whom were watching him with expressions of curiosity, confusion, and in some cases what might have been respect. He had spent 3 years at the Institute learning about different species and their approaches to engineering, but this was the first time he felt like they actually wanted to understand the human perspective. "It's pretty simple," Jake began, standing up and walking over to his bunker. "Everyone else here built shelters. I built a home." Kleptok tilted his head in the characteristic Zenturian gesture of confusion. "Could you clarify the distinction between a shelter and a home in this context?" Jake placed his hand on the reinforced wall of his structure. "A shelter is designed to keep you alive until the danger passes. But what if the danger doesn't pass as quickly as expected? What if rescue gets delayed? What if more people show up who need protection? He gestured to the workshop area visible through one of the reinforced windows. A home is a place where you can not just survive, but continue living. You can fix things that break, treat people who get hurt, and even improve your situation. While you wait, Whisper of Stars moved closer, her feline grace evident even in the artificial gravity of the lab. Your structure contains facilities that were not required by the assignment. Medical equipment, manufacturing tools, expanded living areas. This seems inefficient. Inefficient for what? Jake asked. If the goal is to use the minimum resources to barely meet the requirements, then yes, it's inefficient. But if the goal is to make sure everyone survives and stays healthy and sane until they can get back to their normal lives, then efficiency has to be measured differently. Dr. Vorthak stepped forward, his multiple arms gesturing toward the various alien shelters around the lab. The other designs demonstrate mathematical precision and resource optimization. They accomplish the stated objectives with elegant simplicity. And they're all beautiful, Jake agreed genuinely. Each one shows incredible skill and knowledge. But they're built for the scenario described in the assignment, not for the reality of what disasters are actually like. Professor Zixthara moved closer, her form shifting to colors that indicated intense interest. Elaborate on this distinction between assignment scenarios and disaster reality. Jake walked over to Kleptok's elegant crystalline dome. This is a perfect shelter for exactly the situation described in the assignment. 5 beings, 72 hours, Class C impact, standard atmospheric conditions. It will perform flawlessly under those exact circumstances. He moved to his own bunker. But what happens if the meteor impact creates toxic atmospheric conditions? What if one of the 5 people has a medical emergency? What if the 72 hours stretches to a week because rescue operations get delayed by additional meteor impacts? The alien students began to understand what Jake was describing. Their designs were optimized for success under ideal conditions, while his was designed to function even when everything went wrong. Your species builds for failure scenarios, observed Dr. Vorthak. This suggests a fundamentally different approach to risk assessment. Exactly, Jake said. Humans have learned that disasters never follow the plan. The storm is always stronger than predicted. The earthquake lasts longer than expected. The rescue takes more time than anyone thought it would. Lisa stepped forward to support Jake's explanation. Human engineering includes something we call defensive design. You assume that your initial assumptions are wrong, and you build accordingly. Jake nodded. Every human disaster in history has taught us the same lesson. The people who survive are the ones who prepared for things to be worse than expected. Professor Zixthara's form had settled into a steady pattern of deep blue and purple, colors that indicated she was processing new concepts that challenged her existing understanding. This explains the redundant systems, the over-engineered structural elements, and the inclusion of facilities beyond the assignment requirements. Right, Jake said. 3 atmospheric processors instead of 1, because equipment fails. Medical facilities, because people get hurt in disasters. Workshop area, because you always need to repair something. Communication equipment, because isolation destroys morale and hope. Kleptok was taking detailed notes on his tablet. Your approach sacrifices efficiency and resource optimization in favor of operational reliability under degraded conditions. That's one way to put it, Jake agreed. Another way is that we build things that work even when everything else stops working. The discussion continued for another hour as the alien students and faculty asked questions about human engineering. Philosophy. They wanted to understand why humans consistently overbuilt their solutions, why redundancy was considered more important than efficiency, and why human designs always seemed to assume the worst-case scenario. Jake answered there. questions as best he could, explaining concepts like defensive engineering, failure mode analysis, and disaster psychology. He described how human history was filled with examples of elegant, efficient systems failing catastrophically when conditions exceeded their design parameters. "The most beautiful bridge in the world is useless if it collapses in a storm," Jake said. "The most efficient power system is worthless if it fails when people need it most. Sometimes ugly and overbuilt is better than pretty and fragile." Professor Zixthara called for attention as the discussion began to wind down. "Class, this project has demonstrated something important about the diversity of engineering approaches across species. Each design reflects the cultural values and historical experiences of its creator." She gestured to the various shelters around the lab. "The Zentarian approach emphasizes mathematical precision and resource efficiency. The Felinian design prioritizes aesthetic harmony and comfort. The crystalline structures demonstrate materials science excellence." Her form shifted to brighter colors as she looked at Jake's bunker. "The human approach prioritizes operational reliability under adverse conditions, with redundancy and adaptability taking precedence over efficiency or elegance." She paused, her colors cycling through patterns that suggested she was reaching an important conclusion. "All of these approaches have value, but this exercise has revealed that different engineering philosophies serve different purposes." Jake felt a sense of satisfaction as Professor Zixthara announced the final evaluations. His bunker received the highest marks in the class, not just for meeting the assignment requirements, but for demonstrating what she now recognized as advanced disaster psychology and survival architecture. As the other students began packing up their materials and discussing the lessons learned, several approached Jake with requests. They wanted to know if he would teach them about human construction techniques, redundant system design, and defensive engineering principles. "I'd be happy to help," Jake told them. "But remember, this isn't about human methods being better than yours. It's about understanding that different situations require different solutions." Professor Zixthara approached Jake as he was gathering his tools. "Jake Morrison, I will be updating the curriculum to include a new course on comparative engineering philosophies. Would you be interested in serving as a guest lecturer?" Jake smiled as he looked around the lab at his fellow students, many of whom were still examining his bunker and discussing its design features. "I think that sounds like a great idea, Professor. There's a lot we can all learn from each other." The final scene showed Jake helping Kleptok and Whisper of Stars understand the principles behind redundant life support systems, while they explained to him the mathematical elegance and artistic considerations that had guided their own designs. The exchange of ideas continued long after the official class period ended, with students from multiple species working together to understand different approaches to the same fundamental challenge of keeping people safe.